John Studzinski is the Vice Chairman of Blackstone. Thank you, John, for speaking with us.
Yeah, Menaka, wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be here with you in Davos. As I told you, I thought Prime Minister Modi's speech was very powerful. I thought he delivered it in a statesman-like way. I'm delighted he delivered it with great sort of charisma in Hindi and not in English, because I think, as I've said to many people, his real personality and his real sort of ethos and charisma comes out in Hindi. I think he tried to cover perhaps too much, I would say, in a constructively critical way. And those of us who really want to hear about India's role in the world waited and waited, and then finally he got to the point, the punchline, about seeing that India should have a major seat at the table in a multipolar world. So I was glad that he said that. And I think it's important, not only given the population of India, but given the size of India, but also remember, it's such a big economy. And it has an economy aspirationally. It's 1/5 the size of China right now, but it has a lot of potential. And in terms of growth, it's something that investors are very excited about.
How would you contrast the notes that Prime Minister Modi struck versus what Premier Xi had to say in Davos last year, where he surprisingly came out in full force in favor of globalization, in favor of a market-led economy at a time when we were just getting over the fairly, interesting campaign that Donald Trump had fought and won?
I think President Xi's speech reflected China's vision of itself with its 5,000-year history of the world. And remember, President Xi is someone who has played extraordinarily number of roles in the Chinese government. He's been head of a province, he's been a mayor, he's been head of a ministry, he understands a number of industries. So the Chinese have a sort of bottom-up, sort of flying geese formation type meritocratic system. So he is basically the penultimate product of the Chinese system, and he is quintessentially the Chinese leader now. So he was able to put forth a vision, and to a certain extent he turned the world on its head, because starting with President Obama, America began abdicating its role with respect to foreign policy, and that has sort of continued under President Trump to a certain extent. The Chinese obviously are trying to fill that void, and they're doing it quite successfully in terms of trade, in terms of partnerships, globally. And you see it with their Silk Road initiative, but you also see it really across the world. And, of course, you see it, of course, with TPP and a number of other things. Mr. Modi's speech reflected managing expectations. It reflected a lot of humility, and I reflected the fact that he has aspirations for India, but China's been at it for a lot longer than he has. And I think from that point of view, he was much more measured, much more humble, but also aspirational in terms of, I think he sees himself as a transformational leader. And I think we're going to see more of that, obviously, relating to the upcoming election, as he will put forth his vision for his second term.
Absolutely. I think what our audiences are also very keen to know from you, John, is how you're viewing the world in 2018. You always leave us with interesting things to think about. And I think top of that will have to be the mood change here in Davos when it comes to how business leaders and otherwise perceive President Trump. I remember he was being sworn in last year, right, when we were all here in Davos. And the mood seemed a little, we don't know what this presidency is going to bring us. Has it changed for a more upbeat tone? Is it the tax reform? Is it, the way he's dealing with foreign policy?
Well, we could talk for hours about this. First of all, this is the most extraordinary Davos because you've got all the heads of state here.
Absolutely.
So it's the penultimate leader, the penultimate politician here is Klaus Schwab. And he's done a very good job at attracting an enormous number of heads of state here. And I think from that standpoint, he deserves an enormous amount of applause.
Right.
But to a certain extent, this Davos is about the future. And you've got two types of personalities here. You've got what I call identity populists, and then you've got transformational leaders. And I think everybody, depending on the day of the week, some days they're an identity populist, whether it's Trudeau or Trump or even Modi. and then other days of the week they're seen as transformational leaders, whether it's Trudeau, Trump, or Modi. And I think we now have this set of characters here this week, and in one moment you think this is an identity populist, next moment you think it's a transformational leader. So I think it's a very interesting Davos. People are having a hard time finding a pending recession, so people are still positive about the future of the world economy.
That was one of the things that struck me. I think this is the first Davos in a long time. And be careful because you're going to bump into zoom in. Nice to see you, sir. Well, it's been a long time that we've had a Davos that began on a fairly strong, positive note for the global economy, right? And that's been interesting as well. This identity populism and transformational leadership, you know, sort of conflict that you put it, now the way you put it, what does that mean for business world
it's
over?
It's more of a contrast than
contrast,
a conflict.
okay.
I think it's a contrast. Well, I think leaders, business leaders right now are very positive, and they like transformational leaders because they like leaders who have a vision. Because vision means they're putting in place building blocks of a society, of an economy, the way President Xi is obviously doing that with respect to China. But you've seen that increasingly in other parts of the world, and to a certain extent the tax legislation which Donald Trump enacted in the Congress at the end of last year, I think is going to have a big boost to the U.S. economy for a very interesting reason. Remember, 50% of the U.S. economy are small businesses. Those small businesses will materially benefit from the tax reduction, the corporate tax reduction. They'll be able to step up wages, they'll be able to invest, and these people have also historically not had access to the same magnitude of bank financing that large cap companies have. So, and this is 50% of the US economy. So move the camera forward 12 months and that segment of the economy will be motoring ahead, and maybe that means rather than the U.S. economy growing at 3.5%, it's growing at 3.5–4%.
And that's really important because I think, you know, it's also, it's doing two things. In countries like India, it's putting pressure on, you know, their own governments to relook at their tax policies, because we have a clamor from our businessmen saying, hey, make us more competitive. And I think the other thing is that there is a sense of uncertainty on what this will mean for fund flows if large American corporations start, you know, wanting to move their money out from international locations and move it back to America. And I don't know if that's going to happen as a result of this new tax reform. But I wonder if you see that playing into the other uncertainty, which is that we are going to see the Fed shrink its balance sheet this year. We have a new Fed chief. We've heard the ECB say they're going to reconsider September, October onwards. So is that probably the only cloud hanging over us now?
The new Fed chief, Jay Powell, is very much out of central casting Janet Yellen 101.
Okay.
Very much appointed, though, by Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not going to continue with an appointee by President Obama. He wants his own appointee. But to a certain extent, he's showing confidence in the strategy that Janet Yellen and Bernanke prior to that had put in place.
Okay.
Again, it's the interesting thing about Trump is you have to separate the rhetoric on the Twitter feed and in the newspaper every day, and people like you, the media, love his rhetoric, from what he actually does. And what I would ask the international business community when they focus on the U.S. economy, focus on what President Trump actually does
and not
the rhetoric, because they're very different.
Okay, but do you think that this could be potentially this uncertainty in fund flow, whether it's corporate fund flow or it's institutional investor fund flow, is that the only thing that we could potentially need to be wary of through the course of 2018, because everything else seems to be looking much better?
In terms of fund flows, I think people are going to continue to focus on investing globally where talent is. Okay. And remember, American companies see themselves, I don't like to use the word global, I like to use the word multinational.
Okay.
Because global means 100, 200, 300 countries. But most of these big, important tech companies, for example, are multinational. And India, with its population, with its talent, with its talent in technology. It's a very important area in which to invest. And remember, it's still one of the biggest emerging middle-class populations in the world. Let's not forget that. And we haven't really talked too much in the last couple of years at Davos about the Indian middle class, but it is continuing to emerge, and it is a bigger and bigger population of people who are very brand conscious and who are also interested in a whole range of products. So you can't ignore it.
Okay. Geopolitically, and because we discussed this last year as well, the US-Iran situation doesn't seem as bad as it did 6-8 months ago. You know, the North Korea situation that seemed like it was hitting crisis level seems to be now a little less crisis level, a little bit more diffused, what with, you know, the Winter Games sort of peace that they've made. So I'm just wondering, it seems to be like 2018 is going to be what we haven't seen in almost a decade, a peaceful, calm year.
I think we have to be a bit careful. You can't generalize about Asia. On one hand, there's been a very big step up in military spending in Asia. China has spent more money on its navy in the last year than it has spent in the previous 5 years. Japan is now reinstating more material defense spending. So you're having a militarization, and as we know, the historical relationships among China, Korea, and Japan is very mixed. So that, coupled with Trump's unpredictable, hard to read, on a good day you'd say nimble, on an awkward day you'd say somewhat erratic foreign policy with respect to North Korea, has brought the two Koreas together in a constructive way. And I think you've got to give Trump some degree of credit for that. That didn't happen serendipitously. That actually happened because, to a certain extent, they realized maybe they need to talk about some type of Korean greater collaboration. And I'm not so sure I will use the word reunification because that's far too costly, but certainly collaboration. But so the Asian sphere is still very complicated from a military point of view. And what we all fear in Asia, of course, is an accident. That someone who's not experienced, either in the Navy vessel or something, mistakenly, you know, we had this interesting incident last week in Hawaii, which was entirely a faux pas by a worker being tired and just pushing the wrong switch. But there could have easily been a hacker who hacked his way into something to try to create a sense of panic or miss signals which could have precipitated something much more material on an international level. So cyber security and cyber terrorism, we've got to keep in mind there's that threat, and that's not going to go away. If anything, that's getting much more material.
We're on camera twice over, I think. But okay, so one final question then, because it is turning colder, which is that what will be then the most interesting challenge of 2018 from a business point of view? Will it be getting over the unpredictability of our leaders?
Well, from a business point of view, from an investing point of view, you know, everyone walks in and says, you know, should we start moving stocks in the United States into cash? Real estate's very expensive. Can we continue to invest? And our answer is yes, as long as you find the right real estate and you can enhance its value by buy, fix, and hold, or buy, fix, and sell. And there are a lot of innovation cities in the world. You know, there's Bangalore, Berlin, Stockholm, of course, Seattle, Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's a lot of innovation cities. So, but people are still saying this is the second largest economic expansion since 1991, which of course ended with the bubble in 2000. So there's an anxiety. But remember, there's two schools of thought. There's data which show at some point this is going to happen. No one can see any evidence of the investment expansion and the performance of the stock market or anything halting. Low volatility, low chance of recession, low interest rates,
low inflation,
extremely strong companies in India, Japan, much more focused on corporate governance, much more focused on dividends, much more focused on share buybacks. So people are much more conscious of the global investment behavior. So at the moment, I would say the biggest anxiety is people are saying, how long is this going to exist? And at what point do we call the top? And you know, you'll have a lot of experts. I'm not an investor per se, so I'm not going to tell you when to call the top, but that's going to be the issue, I think, as we go through the second half of 2018.
Very few people succeed in being able to call the top successfully.
Yes.
So thank you very much, John,
You're
for your
welcome.
time.
No, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. And have a great Davos the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Days away from the union budget and